The slap landed like thunder. It was sudden, sharp, and so out of place that for a split second, every sound in the cabin vanished. No rolling carts, no seatbelt clicks, no polite chatter of boarding passengers, only the echo of a hand meeting skin. Heads snapped toward the front of first class. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The stillness that followed was heavier than silence. It was the weight of disbelief pressing against every seat. A woman gasped so loudly that others turned just to see her wide eyes. A man further back whispered, "Did that really just happen?" Another didn't bother whispering. His phone was already up, camera recording, the small red light capturing what the entire row had just witnessed. Others quickly followed. Screens lifted like shields, lenses pointed at the aisle, each person knowing instinctively that what had happened wasn't ordinary, wasn't small, and wasn't about to stay hidden on that plane. The flight attendant stood frozen, her palms still hovering mid-air, as if even she couldn't quite believe she had done it. Her polished smile cracked into something harsher, half triumph, half fear. Around her, uniforms stiffened. A couple in the aisle seats leaned closer to each other, their whispers sharper now. "That's what you get," murmured under their breath. But most of the cabin just stared, too stunned to process. Phones caught the moment, but they also caught what came after. The man in the seat didn't leap up. He didn't shout, didn't hurl an insult, didn't raise his hand back. He sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening only slightly, his gaze lifting with a steadiness that unsettled more than any outburst ever could. The redness on his cheek stood out against his calm posture. It wasn't compliance, and it wasn't defeat. It was the silence of someone who understood power differently than the rest of the room. The tension broke not with his reaction, but with the murmurs of those around him. She didn't just, "Wait, why? That's going too far." And still, the flight attendant doubled down. "Passengers are expected to cooperate. If you don't comply, there will be consequences." Her voice was sharper now, carrying over the cabin. But the problem was clear. No one had seen him misbehave. He had simply sat where his ticket said he belonged. The confrontation was hers, not his, and still she had raised her hand. The atmosphere thickened. Half the cabin looked shocked. The other half looked ready to excuse it. Phones angled for the best view. Passengers holding their breath, each of them aware they were part of something that would not fade when the plane landed. Let me pause here for a second. If stories like this matter to you, stories that shine a light on dignity, justice, and truth, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see just how far this story travels. Because this isn't just about a slap. That sound was the spark, and what followed was fire. The man touched his cheek only once, then lowered his hand, unshaken. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to slice through the cabin chatter. "You just assaulted me." The words spread faster than the slap itself. A ripple of gasps, a clatter as a glass tipped over somewhere in business class, the shuffle of attendants exchanging alarmed glances. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His very composure made everyone aware this wasn't going to be brushed aside with an apology or a shrug. And then he leaned back slightly. His next words, pulling the floor out from under the flight attendant, the crew, and every passenger who thought they understood what they had just witnessed. What no one knew, not the passengers, not even the flight attendant, was that the man they had tried to humiliate was Chief of Police Marcus Grant. Long before the cabin froze under the sound of that slap, Marcus Grant had already been fighting battles far harsher than the narrow aisle of a luxury plane. He had grown up on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood where cracked sidewalks doubled as playgrounds, and police sirens were part of the nightly soundtrack. His mother, a hospital janitor, worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. His father was gone before Marcus was old enough to remember his face. For Marcus, survival wasn't just about food on the table. It was about dignity in a world that tried to strip it away every day. At school, he was the boy told he should lower his expectations. Teachers looked at him and saw statistics, not potential. On the streets, officers sometimes stopped him without reason, demanding explanations he shouldn't have had to give. The first lesson he learned wasn't about justice, it was about suspicion. How quickly it attached to his skin, his voice, his presence. But Marcus never let suspicion be the final word. He read every book he could find in the local library, studied harder than anyone expected, and carried himself with a quiet defiance that turned heads. By the time he entered the police academy at 20, many thought he wouldn't last. He wasn't just black, he was outspoken. He wasn't content to play along with the unspoken rules of silence. That made him a target, but it also made him unforgettable. He graduated top of his class. His colleagues saw his steady hand and sharp instincts, but his superiors often saw only the color of his skin. Promotions came slower for him than for others who had done less. At every rank he had to prove, twice, sometimes 3 times, that he was worthy of the badge he wore. But prove it he did. By his late 30s, he was deputy chief. At 42, he was named chief of police, the first black man to hold the title in one of the largest metropolitan cities in America. The appointment didn't just make headlines, it drew fire. Some whispered he was a symbol, chosen to ease racial tensions. Others doubted he would last a year. But Marcus wasn't interested in symbols. He was interested in change. Under his leadership, outdated training protocols were reformed, oversight committees gained real power, and communities that had long distrusted the badge began to see small but tangible shifts. His reputation spread. Tough but fair, respected even by critics. For every officer who resented his presence, there were communities that finally felt heard. And when national organizations began searching for leaders to speak on reform, Marcus Grant's name always rose to the top. That's why he was on that flight. He wasn't traveling for leisure or for some corporate deal. He was headed to Washington, D.C., to deliver the keynote at a national law enforcement summit. His speech was meant to address systemic racism in policing, accountability, and the cost of silence inside powerful institutions. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he would be flying first class to talk about racial bias while still carrying the weight of it every time he stepped into spaces where his presence was doubted. Marcus knew his success hadn't erased suspicion. Wealth and rank didn't shield him from the glance that lingered too long, the smirk that questioned his belonging, the quiet insult dressed as formality. He had lived it all his life. And though he wore the title of chief, he also carried the memory of every door that had been slammed in his face on the way there. On that flight, none of the passengers knew the man sitting quietly in seat 2A was there to national policy. They didn't know he had risen from cracked sidewalks to command one of the largest forces in the country. They didn't know the weight of the badge he carried, or the years of scars behind it. Because power doesn't travel with you. In first class that day, all anyone saw was a black man they decided didn't belong. The memory of how it began was still fresh. Long before the slap, the tension had been seeded in the small details that everyone else tried to pretend didn't matter. Marcus had walked down the jet bridge with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of carrying a badge heavier than the metal pinned to his chest. He wasn't in uniform, not today, but authority had a way of following him in posture, in stride. Even so, the moment he stepped into first class, the atmosphere shifted. The flight attendant stationed near the galley greeted the older man in front of him with a wide smile, welcoming him like an old friend. But when Marcus handed over his boarding pass, the smile faded into something taut, controlled. Her eyes flicked over the ticket twice, then back at him, as though waiting for the mistake to appear in print. "Are you sure this is your seat, sir?" she asked, tone flat. He didn't bother sighing. He simply pointed to the bold print, "Seat 2A, first class." She glanced again, then forced a nod, stepping aside as if granting permission. The pause lingered long enough to let others in the cabin notice. Marcus slid into his seat, lifting his bag into the overhead bin. The leather creaked as he sat, but his mind was already elsewhere. He had prepared notes for his speech, headlines he knew would follow, the impact of every word he planned to deliver. But around him, the cabin was buzzing with a different kind of conversation. Across the aisle, a white couple leaned toward each other, their whispers sharp but just loud enough to carry. "Probably a mistake. Upgrades these days are out of control." The man chuckled under his breath, glancing toward Marcus as if expecting him to flinch. The woman smirked and shook her head, eyes trailing over his suit, his bag, the watch on his wrist, as if each piece of him required explanation. He ignored them. Years had taught him the discipline of silence, the kind that made the offender more uncomfortable than the target. Still, their words clung to the air, infecting the rows around them. Another passenger, a businessman in a navy suit, gave Marcus a quick once-over before settling into his seat. His brow furrowed slightly, the way people sometimes do when they can't reconcile what they see with what they think they know. He didn't speak, but the message in his eyes was the same. You don't belong here. The attendant returned with water bottles for the couple across the aisle. Her voice warm, pleasant. When she turned to Marcus, her tone cooled again. Drink, she asked, clipped and professional, stripped of every courtesy she'd just given them. Ginger ale, please. The pause before her response was deliberate. She handed over the can unopened, no glass, no ice, no smile. A small dismissal, but clear enough to sting. Marcus thanked her anyway. Dignity, he knew, was measured not by the service you received, but by the way you chose to respond. But it wasn't just the whispers or the tone. It was the stares that carried weight. The woman 2 rows behind him kept her phone angled in his direction, pretending to scroll but occasionally snapping the camera into focus. A young man across the aisle tugged at his sleeve nervously, then leaned into his mother's ear, whispering something that made her glance sharply toward Marcus and then away again. None of it was new. These were the same battles he had fought at dinner parties, in boardrooms, even in his own precinct on occasion. Places where wealth and rank never seemed enough to outweigh the bias written into other people's expectations. Marcus adjusted his seatbelt, forced his focus back to the file in his lap, and waited for the hum of the engines to take over. But the hum never came. Instead, the atmosphere thickened. The stares lingered longer, the whispers grew sharper. The smiles disappeared. And as the doors closed and the crew prepared for departure, the mood in first class was no longer polite unease. It was something heavier, something that promised escalation. The glances hardened, and then words turned into confrontation. The first sign that the tension wasn't going to fade came when the flight attendant circled back to Marcus's row. She already had his ticket on file, had already seen his seat assignment, but still she leaned in again, eyes narrowed, hand outstretched. Sir, I'll need to see your boarding pass once more. Marcus kept his tone even as he slid the stub across the tray. She studied it far longer than necessary, her gaze flicking between the paper and his face as if waiting for the ink to rearrange itself into something that justified her doubt. It says 2A, he reminded her calmly. Her lips tightened. Yes? Well, just making sure. She placed it back in his hand without apology, the smirk on her face carrying the same message as before. You're here, but you shouldn't be. The couple across the aisle exchanged a knowing look. The woman muttered, Upgrades really are out of hand. Her husband chuckled, loud enough for Marcus to hear, and tilted his champagne flute in mock salute. The attendant moved down the aisle, but her shadow seemed to linger. When she returned with the first drink service, her performance repeated. The couple across the way received warm greetings and sparkling glasses filled with chilled champagne. Marcus received a can of ginger ale, unopened, placed heavily on his tray without a glass or even a napkin. He thanked her anyway. His composure unsettled her more than protest ever could. But other eyes were watching. A man a few rows back lifted his phone, angling the camera just high enough to catch Marcus in the frame. Another, pretending to check his messages, tilted his screen to record video. The glow of devices dotted the cabin like fireflies, each one documenting, each one quietly acknowledging that what was happening wasn't ordinary. Still, the attendant's tone sharpened. Sir, please keep your seat upright at all times. We expect compliance. Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't reclined his chair. He hadn't spoken out of turn. The words weren't instructions. They were warnings disguised as protocol. And then the unusual happened. The captain himself emerged from the cockpit. Pilots rarely stepped into first class except for polite greetings or quick checks. But now he strode down the aisle, cap brim casting a shadow, eyes scanning the rows before locking onto Marcus. Is there a problem here? He asked, voice clipped, carrying just enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. The attendant leaned toward him, whispering something Marcus couldn't catch. The pilot nodded curtly, then fixed his stare back on the man in 2A. Sir, passengers are required to follow the crew's instructions at all times, the captain said. His tone wasn't neutral. It dripped with accusation, as if Marcus had already broken every rule. Marcus kept his voice calm. I'm seated where I was assigned. I haven't caused any disturbance. A ripple passed through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged smirks as though a show was about to begin. Phones tilted higher, recording openly now. The couple across the aisle leaned forward, eager, their eyes shining with a mix of anticipation and vindication. The captain adjusted his tie, stepped closer, and lowered his voice just enough to carry menace. "Then let's make sure there are no more misunderstandings." Marcus didn't flinch. His reply was steady, his eyes level. "There won't be. Unless you create one." For a heartbeat, the air between them crackled. Passengers leaned in, sensing the line had been drawn. Some were appalled, others entertained, but none could look away. And then, in a moment that stunned even the ones rooting against him, the slap came. The sound tore through the cabin louder than the engines beneath the floor. A single, open-handed strike, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a stumble, wasn't an accident, wasn't the turbulence of a rough takeoff. It was deliberate, sharp, and humiliating. For a second, the entire row froze as though time itself had stumbled. The woman beside Marcus gasped so violently she nearly spilled her drink. A man in row 3 muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Dozens of eyes locked on the scene, each one wide with disbelief. The silence was suffocating. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not the faint hum of conversation, just the heavy echo of a handprint still burning across Marcus's cheek. And then, voices fractured the stillness. From behind, "You can't do that." A passenger's outrage cut sharp through the air. Another voice, lower but bitter, "Bet he mouthed off first." Someone else chimed in, "This is why flights get delayed." The division was immediate. Half the cabin recoiled at what they had witnessed. The other half scrambled to excuse it, clinging to stereotypes they'd carried long before stepping on the plane. Phones were everywhere now. Screens tilted forward, red recording lights flashing, fingers trembling as they tried to steady their cameras. The moment wasn't just being witnessed. It was being documented, captured from every angle, already moving beyond the cabin toward a world waiting to be outraged. The flight attendant, who had delivered the blow, stood rigid, her face pale but her jaw tight. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. "Passengers must comply with crew instructions," she snapped, voice rising with desperation. "We will not tolerate disruption." But her words faltered against the reality that no one had seen Marcus do anything except sit in his seat. There was no outburst, no refusal. The disruption hadn't come from him, it had come from her. The couple across the aisle leaned closer, smugness creeping back into their voices. "Well, he must have done something. You don't get slapped for nothing." Their tone wasn't shocked. It was satisfied, as though the spectacle confirmed beliefs they'd long carried. But the passengers recording weren't letting it slide. "She hit him for no reason," one woman whispered loudly into her phone camera. Another passenger leaned into the aisle, saying directly to the lens, "This is going viral. People need to see this." Still, the attendant raised her chin, barking orders she no longer had the authority to enforce. "Phones down. Stop recording." Her hands shook as she gestured at the rows of glowing screens, but not a single passenger lowered their device. If anything, more lifted into the air, a sea of witnesses refusing to be silenced. The captain lingered close by, his expression caught between pride and panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the weight of all those recording lenses silenced him faster than any argument. His authority, once unchallenged, now trembled under the glow of digital evidence. The air was heavy with division. Outrage and complicity clashed in the same confined space. Some passengers whispered about lawsuits, others muttered about troublemakers ruining travel. And through it all, Marcus sat in his seat, the redness of the blow visible but his composure unbroken. He didn't rise. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. Marcus did not shout. He simply spoke, words that turned the entire cabin upside down. The sting on his cheek had barely faded when Marcus finally broke his silence. His voice was calm, steady, and low enough to force everyone to lean in, but every syllable carried the weight of law. "I am Chief of Police Marcus Grant," he said evenly, eyes locked on the attendant. "And you just assaulted me." The words didn't rise above a whisper, but they detonated across the cabin. The couple across the aisle stopped smirking mid-breath, their faces snapping forward. Phones that had been recording quietly now lifted higher, catching every angle, every expression. Gasps rippled row by row as passengers repeated it in hushed tones, like a wave moving through the aircraft. "Did he say Chief of Police? Wait, did I hear that right? Oh, she's finished." The flight attendant's face drained of color. For a moment, she stood motionless, her hands still trembling by her side. Then she snapped back into her mask of authority. "Sir," she stammered, "there must be some misunderstanding. I was only—" "Misunderstanding?" a voice barked from 3 rows back. "We all saw you hit him." Another passenger chimed in, phone raised high. "This is already live, everyone's watching." The pilot stepped forward, his presence a shield for his crew. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," he said, his voice carrying the crisp command of authority. "The situation is under control." But nothing was under control. His attempt at reassurance only drew laughter and outrage. Someone shouted, "Control! He just told you who he is." Another added, "You're finished, Captain. Don't cover this up." The pilot's jaw flexed. He turned to Marcus, as if trying to regain control by sheer posture alone. "Chief Grant," he said, forcing a polite tone, "perhaps we can step off this flight and resolve this quietly." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Quietly? You want me to disappear while the cameras are rolling? That won't happen." The murmurs grew louder, more passengers emboldened by his refusal to bow. What had started as scattered whispers now swelled into open voices, some cheering him on, others recording play-by-play commentary. Still, the attendant tried to salvage her position. "I didn't mean, it was protocol." Her excuses fumbled into nothing under the weight of all those screens pointed her way. Every word she spoke was evidence against her, and she knew it. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm authority held more power than their uniforms combined. "You didn't just slap a passenger," he said. "You slapped the chief of police of one of the largest cities in this country. You did it in front of over 100 witnesses and a dozen recording devices. Do you really think this ends with protocol?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even those who had muttered their doubts earlier now shrank into their seats. There was no room left for excuse or denial. The pilot glanced toward the galley, signaling the attendants to control the cabin, but the gesture fell flat. Nothing could be contained now. The story wasn't theirs to bury anymore. It belonged to every passenger with a phone in their hand and outrage in their voice. And as Marcus sat back in his seat, posture still calm, the truth settled heavy in the air. The problem for them was not just that Marcus was a passenger, but that justice flew with him. The announcement of Marcus's authority rippled through the rows, but instead of ending the confrontation, it cracked the cabin in 2. On one side were passengers who had seen enough. A man in the 5th row stood halfway, his phone still recording. "You need to apologize to him right now," he demanded. "We all watched you slap him." His voice shook, not from fear but from outrage. A woman across the aisle nodded in agreement, raising her phone higher. "This isn't just wrong, it's criminal." But the other side leaned into the oldest scripts, their whispers dripping with stereotypes, as if trying to bend the reality before their eyes. "Chief of police or not, he must have provoked it," one muttered, shaking his head. Another scoffed. "People like him always play the victim." The words carried, slicing the cabin into sharper lines of division. Marcus sat steady in 2A, hands folded, his silence more commanding than their insults. He had seen these fractures his entire life, communities split between those willing to see the truth and those who clung to excuses, no matter the evidence. The same battle he had fought on city streets was now playing out 30,000 feet above them. The flight attendant, pale but determined, refused to yield. Her voice trembled at first but then hardened, clinging to the only tool she had left, arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, forcing formality into her words, "our crew is responsible for the safety of this flight. If passengers cannot comply, we may be forced to return to the gate." The cabin erupted again, outrage layered over disbelief. "Comply?" a man barked. "He's the one following every rule." Another voice joined in, louder, angrier. "We saw you hit him. You should be the one leading this plane." But still, the division held. A businessman further back sneered, speaking to no one and everyone at once. "This is why flights can't leave on time anymore. Always some drama." His tone made it clear who he blamed. The attendant's jaw tightened, her hand gripping the back of a seat as though bracing herself against the storm. She looked toward the captain, silently begging for reinforcement. He shifted uneasily but said nothing, his silence betraying the authority that had just crumbled around him. Marcus finally broke through the noise. His voice calm but unshakable. "I am not leaving this seat. I am where I belong, and I will not be intimidated." The firmness of his words pulled some passengers back into focus. Applause broke out from a small cluster, hesitant at first, then louder as others joined. The sound wasn't unanimous, but it was enough to shake the illusion of crew control. Phones captured everything: the division, the arrogance, the applause. Clips were already uploading, texts already flying through the air at speeds faster than the aircraft itself. The evidence of what had happened and how the crew responded was multiplying by the second. The attendant's composure wavered. Her smile, forced and brittle, cracked under the pressure of so many lenses pointed at her. Yet instead of backing down, she clung to her authority like a mask. "This is our aircraft," she snapped, her tone now sharp enough to cut. "We decide who stays and who goes." But the problem was no longer hers to decide. The division in the cabin wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a story spilling far beyond those narrow rows. By then, the world outside the aircraft was already watching. The cabin was divided, but the internet wasn't waiting for the debate to settle. Before the aircraft even pushed back from the gate, passengers were uploading the footage. A dozen different angles caught the slap, the stunned silence, the straight, and Marcus's calm revelation of who he was. Within minutes, the first clips appeared on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. "Flight attendant slaps passenger in first class. He's the chief of police," one caption screamed. Another post zoomed in on the redness across Marcus's cheek, the words underneath reading, "This is America, 2025. Hashtags multiplied. Chief Grant trended within 20 minutes. Flying while black and airline assault followed close behind. Comments poured in, thousands at first, then tens of thousands. "This is disgusting. Fire her immediately. Notice how calm he is while they lose control." Proof racism never takes a day off. Others tried to excuse it, their bias laid bare in every sentence. "Must have done something. Respect the crew or get removed." Always playing the race card. The argument raged across screens, but the evidence didn't lie. Millions were now watching the same moment play out in endless loops. The attendant's hand connecting with his face, the captain's silence, and Marcus introducing himself with quiet authority. Back on the ground, the airline's corporate headquarters felt the storm before the flight even left the gate. Their public relations team's phones lit up with alerts. Reporters were calling. Investors were emailing. Social feeds filled with clips of the slap, each one racking up views in the millions. A panicked conference call sparked into life. "Do we confirm the incident?" one executive demanded. "We can't say anything until we know if the footage is authentic," another replied, though the truth was obvious. The videos were too clear, too widespread, too damning. "Draft a statement," the head of PR ordered, her voice sharp with stress. "Say we're investigating. Say this doesn't represent our values." But no words could outpace the speed of outrage. Airlines had dealt with scandals before, but rarely had the victim been someone with both authority and credibility. This wasn't just a passenger. This was a black chief of police en route to a national summit on justice, and he had been slapped in front of an entire cabin under the eyes of countless recording devices. Back in the sky, Marcus remained silent, his posture unwavering. He didn't need to fuel the chaos. The evidence was already working on his behalf. Around him, passengers whispered updates. "It's already online. Look, 10 million views. They're saying his name, Chief Marcus Grant." The attendant, now visibly shaken, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Please," she pleaded, "phones down. This is a federal offense, to record inside the aircraft." The words only made things worse. Passengers laughed bitterly, their cameras still held high. "Assaulting a passenger's a federal offense," someone shouted back. The attendant's shoulders stiffened, her mask of authority crumbling one crack at a time. The captain retreated toward the cockpit, muttering to his first officer. He knew the situation had already spiraled beyond his command. The authority he carried in the cabin was nothing compared to the authority of public outrage roaring through every feed on the ground. Still, Marcus said nothing. His silence was its own kind of statement, steady, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. While the crew panicked, while the airline scrambled, he simply sat in 2A, composed as ever. Because he understood something the others didn't. The battle wasn't in the air. It wasn't in the whispers, or even in the hashtags. The real reckoning would come not in the air, but the moment the wheels touched the ground. The descent began in silence, but it wasn't the usual calm before arrival. Every passenger felt the weight of what waited below. Screens still glowed as videos spread further, some passengers live streaming from the cabin itself. By the time the wheels touched down, millions around the world had already taken sides. The aircraft rolled to the gate, but instead of the familiar chime inviting passengers to disembark, there was a pause. Outside the window, flashing lights reflected against the glass. Airport security vehicles clustered near the jet bridge, and beyond them, a wall of cameras and reporters pressed against the barriers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, stiff and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain seated until further instructions." But the order carried no weight now. Every passenger knew the truth. This flight had become a crime scene and a media event rolled into one. When the door finally opened, uniformed officers stepped aboard. They weren't here for Marcus. Their eyes went straight to the front of the cabin, to the attendant who had struck him and the captain who had enabled it. Passengers cheered softly, phones lifted higher. But before the officers could proceed, two men in tailored suits slipped onto the plane. Airline executives, badges clipped to their belts, faces drawn tight with panic. They bypassed security, heading directly for Marcus's row. "Chief Grant," one said quickly, his tone both deferential and desperate. "We'd like to discuss this matter privately before it escalates further. We can arrange a quiet resolution." Marcus didn't move. His voice carried just enough volume for the nearest rows to hear. "Quiet resolution? You want me to disappear this as though nothing happened?" "Sir," the second executive pleaded, lowering his voice, "this doesn't have to go public." A passenger nearby laughed bitterly. "It already is public. Millions are watching." Marcus stood slowly, his presence commanding without a single raised word. "Every passenger here is a witness," he said firmly. "You will not silence them, and you will not silence me." The declaration brought applause from the back rows, phones catching every moment. The executives exchanged looks, realizing the control they once had was gone. The flight attendant who had slapped him sat slumped against the galley wall, her earlier arrogance replaced by fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but the noise of reporters outside drowned her words. Their shouts filtered faintly through the door. "Chief Grant? Did she really hit you? Will you press charges?" Security officers gestured for Marcus to exit first. The aisle cleared almost instinctively, passengers leaning back to give him space. As he walked forward, cameras outside the jet bridge flashed in a storm of white light, their beams cutting through the narrow tunnel. The executives tried once more, hurrying beside him. "Please, Chief, allow us to make a formal statement on your behalf. We'll cover accommodations, compensation." Marcus stopped at the threshold, turning just enough to let them see the resolve in his eyes. "You don't buy your way out of this," he said. "Accountability doesn't come with a check." And with that, he stepped into the storm of cameras, the flashbulbs reflecting off his face, the red marks still visible for all to see. The attendant and captain were escorted out separately, their heads bowed against the barrage of questions. Passengers streamed off behind them, many pausing to tell reporters exactly what they had seen. No script, no spin, just raw testimony. The airline had hoped to contain the damage. Instead, the spectacle only grew. And then came the press conference, one that no one would forget. The press conference wasn't scheduled. It wasn't planned. It was demanded. By the crowd of reporters who had gathered outside the terminal, their microphones raised like a forest of questions. They weren't waiting for the airline's statement. They wanted to hear from the man at the center of it all. Marcus stepped to the podium with the steadiness of someone who had carried a badge for decades. His cheek was still marked by the slap, but his composure radiated strength. Cameras zoomed in on that red imprint. The undeniable proof of what had happened in first class. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence of anticipation gave his words all the weight they required. "My name is Marcus Grant. I am chief of police for one of the largest cities in this country. And yesterday, aboard this airline, I was assaulted. Not because I was unruly. Not because I disobeyed instructions. I was assaulted because bias and arrogance convinced someone that I did not belong where my ticket said I should be." Flashes burst across the room. Reporters scribbled notes. The clip of his words streamed live, reaching millions within minutes. "This isn't about one slap," Marcus continued. "It's about a system that allows everyday prejudice to escalate into violence." I sat in my seat quietly, and yet suspicion followed me. The assumption wasn't that I was a paying passenger. The assumption was that I was a problem. And that assumption turned into an assault witnessed by every person on that flight. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising as his words hit deeper than the surface incident. He wasn't just telling his story, he was putting a spotlight on the pattern, one far larger than a single airline employee. Behind the cameras, airline representatives shifted uncomfortably. One executive cleared his throat, stepping forward with a prepared statement. "Our company deeply regrets the incident," he said quickly. "We are conducting a full investigation. This does not reflect our values." But the statement crumbled before it could take root. Reporters cut him off, demanding, why was he questioned multiple times about his seat? Why was he struck in front of witnesses? Why did your crew escalate instead of de-escalate? The executives' rehearsed lines dissolved under the fire of live accountability. Meanwhile, networks looped the footage on giant screens. Clips replayed again and again. The slap, the stunned passengers, Marcus declaring his title. Commentators filled the airwaves. Civil rights leaders called for accountability. Advocacy groups issued statements demanding reform in airline training and conduct. And yet Marcus didn't frame it as his personal grievance. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. "It's about every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong. It's about every black man and woman who has walked into a space and been treated as though their presence was an error. That is not just disrespect. It is systemic racism, and it must end." The crowd erupted into applause, not from the reporters, but from ordinary people standing behind the barricades, travelers who had stopped to listen. His words carried past microphones, past television screens, into the homes of families across the country. The airline tried again to apologize, their spokesperson reading a statement about isolated incidents and values of inclusivity. But the damage was already too great. Social media mocked the apology. Stock analysts speculated on the fallout. Civil rights organizations announced boycotts. Marcus left the podium as calmly as he had arrived, flanked not by bodyguards but by witnesses, ordinary passengers who had stood beside him, ready to testify to what they had seen. The reporters shouted one final question. "Chief Grant, what happens next?" Marcus paused only briefly, his voice steady. "Accountability." The stock market opened the next morning with a brutal surprise for the airline. When the stock market bell rang the following morning, the airline's ticker opened lower than it had in years. Within an hour, shares dropped 12%. By midday, billions in market value had evaporated. Investors, watching the endless replay of the slap on cable news, flooded executives with furious calls. It wasn't just the stockholders who were panicking. Major partners began to distance themselves. Travel agencies pulled promotional deals. Hotels tied to the airline cut advertising contracts. The brand that had once marketed itself on comfort and prestige was now synonymous with racism and abuse of power. Boycotts erupted across social media. Civil rights groups announced nationwide campaigns urging travelers to choose competitors. Hashtags demanding accountability trended for a second day straight. Fueled by clips of Marcus's press conference, screens replayed his steady voice, his refusal to be silenced, the red mark still visible on his cheek as he spoke of systemic racism. By afternoon, lawsuits were already being filed. Passenger rights attorneys announced class actions, citing negligence, discrimination, and unlawful assault. Several passengers who had recorded the slap volunteered their testimony publicly, refusing to let the airline spin the story as a misunderstanding. The narrative belonged to the people who had witnessed it, and they weren't letting it go. The airline scrambled to contain the fallout. Press releases poured out of their headquarters, apologies, promises of training, pledges to investigate. But every statement was met with ridicule. Memes mocked their values of inclusivity, contrasting the polished words with the raw footage of the slap. Public trust, once hard-earned, was unraveling in real time. Inside the company, scapegoats were quickly chosen. The flight attendant who had delivered the slap was suspended immediately, then quietly terminated when public outrage made suspension look too soft. The captain who had tried to shield her was also removed from duty, his decades of service erased in a single decision to back arrogance over justice. But the firings did nothing to slow the damage. Commentators pointed out that these weren't just bad apples. They were symptoms of a culture that tolerated bias until it exploded into violence. Marcus's words were played across networks. I was assaulted, not because I broke rules, but because bias convinced them I didn't belong. Through it all, Marcus carried himself with the same composure he had shown on the plane. He released a short written statement not about his own humiliation, but about the larger fight. "This was never about me alone," he wrote. "It was about dignity denied to too many for too long. I had a platform and witnesses. Others do not. Accountability cannot end with one employee or one flight. It must reach the systems that allow prejudice to become practice." The words struck harder than any market analysis. Communities across the country rallied behind him. Civic groups demanded congressional hearings into airline discrimination. Legislators, sensing the political momentum, called for stricter oversight of the industry. Executives met behind closed doors, desperate to salvage what remained. But no amount of restructuring could erase the image of Marcus sitting calmly in 2A, cheek burning red, eyes unflinching as he declared who he was. That moment had crystallized into something far larger than one airline scandal. The financial fallout was only the beginning. The cultural reckoning had just started. Because what Marcus did next transformed humiliation into reform. The story of Marcus Grant did not end in a cabin thousands of feet above the ground. It did not end in the boardroom of shaken executives or in the courtroom of looming lawsuits. It lived far beyond those spaces because it exposed something too familiar, something many had endured in silence. Racism does not always arrive in shouts. It hides in clipped tones, in questions of belonging, in the way one person is asked for proof again and again while another is waved through without pause. It hides in uniforms meant to project authority and in titles meant to guarantee safety. But when it lashes out, when arrogance grows so bold it leaves a mark, the world is reminded of the truth. Silence is no protection. Dignity is. Marcus never raised his hand, never raised his voice. He did not need to. His composure, born of years navigating suspicion and bias, dismantled an entire illusion of control. An attendant thought her authority made him small. A captain thought his uniform made him untouchable. But one man's calm presence revealed their arrogance for what it was. Fragility dressed as power. That is why the footage traveled so far. People did not just see a slap, they saw the mask pulled off a system that still doubts, still diminishes, still punishes those who do not look like they belong. And they saw, in Marcus, the opposite. A black man who refused to shrink, who reminded the world that dignity is not granted by a ticket or a seat assignment. Dignity is carried, and it cannot be slapped away. Communities across the country replayed his words. This was never about me alone. It was about dignity denied to too many for too long. In classrooms, offices, and living rooms, those words sparked conversations that had been too easy to avoid. His calm became a mirror for an entire nation. And yet the irony remained. Marcus was the chief of police, someone whose very signature could change precincts, whose speeches could shape national debates. And still, on that flight, none of it mattered. To the attendant, he was simply a black man in the wrong seat. That is the truth racism forces us to face. Achievement, title, or status do not erase prejudice. They only expose it in sharper contrast. But Marcus turned humiliation into reform. His courage forced accountability, not just for a single airline, but for a culture of unchecked bias. Policy reviews began. Mandatory anti-discrimination training spread across the industry. Passengers demanded stronger protections, not just for executives with titles, but for every traveler who has been told they don't belong. The lesson was simple, but profound. The slap was meant to silence. Instead, it became the sound of a reckoning. And that is the echo that matters. The one that tells us dignity, once defended, can never be ignored again. What about you? What would you have done if you were Marcus Grant, seated in 2A as the world turned against you? Drop your thoughts below, share your country flag, and don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because stories like this remind us, dignity is priceless.